While initially it might have seemed like the situation in the bayous of Louisiana couldn't get any worse, as the corruption had infected and killed off a majority of the local population before bringing the dead back from their graves to prey upon whoever still drew breath within the swamps, things were about to take a turn for the worse. The outsider, a man by the name of Dr. Huff Jones, was the director of the American Hunters Association, an organization that for hundreds of years had hunted the demonic, the otherworldly, and other paranormal activities on the American continent. Arrived in Louisiana through the New Orleans harbor and immediately set up his base of operations, where he would conjure up a plan to deal with the corruption. Having identified the source behind the corruption as a so-called sculptor, an entity from another realm or universe that had transcended the barriers between our world and its own, and which had the capacity to manipulate and create occult and wicked abominations by harvesting and assimilating organic material. Huff's organization were familiar with the phenomenon, having dealt with such an entity in the past, and knew that the rampant effects of the corruption could prove problematic if left unchecked. As he surveyed the situation, Huff saw that the effects of the corruption were about to spill over from the bayous and potentially move towards larger cities, which undoubtedly would have caused a chain reaction, as the corruption would have gained access to an almost unlimited supply of vector carriers and potential infected, an outcome that could threaten the very existence of mankind, and a situation that required immediate containment. Because of this, Huff opened up the so-called hunting grounds and allowed his associates of the organization to enter the bayous with the purpose of killing the monsters lurking in the swamps, hoping to contain the spread of the corruption and ultimately find and destroy the source of the problem. The demon hunters, also referred to as hunters, some naturally immune to the effects of the corruption, others inoculated with a simple herbal concoction that protected them from the effects of the corruption, took to the bayous, striking down the grunts as tenaciously as their weapons and will allowed them. But it would seem that Huff had underestimated the ferocity of the corruption, as by now, thousands of grunts were roaming the swamps, and the hunters had very little success in making a dent in the overwhelming forces they met, as any number of grunts that were killed were easily replaced by the corruption. With no end to the forces on the other side, it was obvious that if they were to contain the corruption, they would have to approach the problem from another angle. Huff then turned his attention to the rifts, as he saw these portals as the direct influence of the sculptor's corruption, from where its destructive effects oozed into our realm, spreading and contaminating anything in its immediate area. Huff hypothesized that by closing off the sculptor's source of influence, he could potentially rob it of its power and effects within our world. Huff offered hefty sums of money to any hunter brave enough to approach these portals with the intentions of closing them off for good. Initially, the plan seemed to work. One by one, the rifts were closed off by the hunters of the organization, and it seemed to have an immediate effect on the corruption's influence within the bayous. And with the sculptor's presence deteriorating, it didn't take long before Huff felt confident that the organization would be able to contain the spread of the infection. But then, something odd happened. Fewer and fewer hunters seemed to come back from their expeditions to close off the rifts, and the ones that did bore horrible tales of new evil now lurking within the swamps. The mutilated corpses of women, torn apart by protruding beehives, were now roaming the bayous. These atrocious walking nightmares marked the end of any naturally living women within the swamps, as they were spawned within the womb of any female that lacked protection against the effects of the corruption within the hunting grounds. These hives carried thousands of ferocious bees and hornets within them, each with a venom so potent that any natural resistance or protective serum against the corruption was rendered ineffective immediately, allowing these swarms to kill off any hunter within seconds should they be careless enough to get too close. However, as if the journey through the hunting grounds hadn't become dangerous enough already, the hunters that actually managed to reach their destination at the rifts were now faced with another challenge before they could close them off. Guarding these rifts were a new variation of the grunt, heavy, armored, and far more vicious in terms of ferocity than any regular grunt. Cocooned from within the corruption itself, molded in several layers of what visually resembled the same material as a beehive, but with structural behavior of wood, these armored were protected by a thick chitinous casing, and these sentinels would now safeguard the rifts from any approaching hunter, chasing them down with relentless speed while being almost completely invulnerable to regular firearms, catching the hunters off guard before striking them down. Huff contemplated the situation. The hunters had shown up in the bayous, resistant to the effects of the corruption itself, and immune to the spread of the infection through the grunts. In the light of this, a new threat had emerged, coincidentally with the ability to infect and kill the immune hunters, while at the same time, the rifts that they had been targeting specifically and closing off were suddenly safeguarded by a ferocious monster with the capability to withstand gunfire. It was all too odd of an occurrence to be coincidence. It would seem that the corruption, contrary to any other rampant disease, wasn't just driven by a chaotic desire for pure consumption. No, it was aware of the AHA's presence, it had adapted to their response, and it had taken measures against them to preserve itself. Huff was speechless. This sculpture was unlike anything his organization had encountered before. However, the escalation of force that followed after these initial encounters with the hives and the armored would make everything prior pale in comparison. Having resided in a defensive posture, forming a protective barrier around itself with the hives warding off the hunters and the heavy armor protecting the rifts, the corruption now went on the offensive. The first wave of direct attacks came through packs of giant rabid dogs. These humongous canines would move in packs of 2 to 4 and were specifically meant to track and target hunters active within the bayous, stalking their prey relentlessly before chasing them down and mauling them. Rumored among some to be rural mastiffs mutilated and changed by the corruption itself, others would argue that they might have been something dragged out from the pits of hell itself. However, if there was any personification of hell within the bayous, it would be in the shape of the immolator. In bodies of roaring fire and raging fury, the immolators were walking powder cakes of relentless anger, forcing the hunters to exercise extreme caution within the bayous, as any piercing of these monsters' skin would cause a fiery explosion and trigger an unyielding rampage of attacks, igniting any surface or hunter caught in its path. While the armored were susceptible to piercings and stabbings, any piercing attack on an immolator would spell disaster for its adversary, making it possible that the idea behind the immolator was to overburden the hunters with complication in terms of a viable weapon choice. The new threats, however, weren't just contained to the fields and plains of the bayous, for within the murky waters of the swamps emerged another source of evil, known as the water devils, consisting of thousands of small worms initially created within the stomach of a hunter who had consumed rotten food. These murderous entities consumed their host from within before spilling out into the waters of the Louisiana bayous. Here they existed in large colonies that violently ravaged ecosystems, causing the extinction of any aquatic animal or organism found within the hunting grounds. And while contained to the waters, the water devil posed from a trauma standpoint the greatest danger of any monster within the bayous. being able to kill off anything that ventured into its territory within seconds. But the biggest change to the corruption, the meatheads, came through a direct attack on the female hunters within the bayous. Not to anyone's surprise, some hunters were engaged in relationship with other hunters. These relationships led to intimacy, and intimacy led to childbearing. However, these children now growing inside the female hunter were not inoculated, and the vast majority of them would not develop a natural resistance to the corruption, and because of this, the sculptor saw a perfect opportunity. Corrupting the fetus within a powerful female hunter led to the birth of this spawn of the devil that tore itself from the womb of the mother, towering far above the tallest man alive. This behemoth of an abomination, both blind and deaf, was basically impervious to damage and used leeches as external sensory organs to both see and hear threats around it, which, when detected, would be chased down with relentless and immensely powerful attacks. These massive creatures would now guard the dozens of compounds within the bayous, which would serve as the most important part of the corruption's influence, the lairs of the sculptor's emissaries. Hey there, Hazmat here. This was only part 2 of a 3-part story, so stay tuned for episode 3. A big thanks goes out to the Hunters Lounge on Patreon, who helps me decide on future content and which you can join for a $1 a month. Link is in the description below. As always, a big thanks to Rexley and Tip from the Showdown Discord for always being there to acknowledge, critique, and guide my approach to these videos. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.